Good afternoon, or good evening if you're joining us from England. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual program, Preserving the History of British Congregationalism, Dr. Williams Library and the Congregational Library London, with our speakers Alan Argent and David Powell. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, and our digital archive with more than 110,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. Please do check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. The inspiration for this winter's virtual lecture series is our new online exhibition, Founding 56, the Congregational Library's original collection. In 1853, a donation of 56 print and manuscript works from 8 donors became the foundational collection for the newly established Congregational Library. Though the collection now numbers nearly 250,000 items, the themes found within those initial volumes have had a significant impact on the library's development. We're exploring different aspects of the library's history through this virtual lecture series. And the inspiration for today's talk comes from the fact that 2 of those 56 volumes were a catalog of Dr. Williams' library from 1841. So from that very founding moment, we see American Congregationalists looking across the Atlantic for inspiration from their British compatriots. I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of our speakers at the start. Alan Argent is the former research fellow at Dr. Williams Library, London, and minister of Trinity Congregational Church, Brixton. He's the author of Dr. Williams Trust and Library, published by Boydell and Brewer in 2022. And he has edited The Angel's Voice for the London Record Society, and is the author of the Richard Baxter Treatises, published by Boydell in 2018, The Transformation of Congregationalism, 1900 to 2000, published by the Congregational Federation in 2013, and a brand new book, actually so new that we haven't even actually gotten our copy here at the library yet, A Brixton Chapel, Gathered to a Quiet Independence, The History of Trinity Chapel, Brixton, published by Box Chapel Press in 2024. Our second speaker is David Powell, the former senior cataloger and archivist of the Congregational Library. He came to the library just after it moved to Gordon Square in 1982, and now that that link with Dr. Williams' library has been severed, is looking forward to overseeing its transfer to new lodgings. He's a trustee of Pollock's Toy Museum, another institution currently without a permanent home, and the author of several books on toy theater.
Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Williams' Library as a stuffy, old-fashioned, almost gentlemen's only club in Gordon Square. Not quite gentlemen's only, but a little. Certainly, it's always had, for me, an old world, musty atmosphere, which could be irritating, but could also be attractive. Totally in contrast to the apparent assembly line efficiency of the British Library and the old British Museum of old. After all, you could get your books within 5 or 10 minutes at Dr. Williams, and this disturbing rush of humanity was kept at a distance. By the late 20th century, Dr. Williams had become known as a primary research facility, replete with unexpected gems, which always took one's breath away. From 18th century communion silver of rare quality to first editions of Jacobean works on mathematics, all of which told you something of the reading matter of our apparently disapproving Puritan ancestors. They didn't stick to Calvinist theology. Among modern scholars, some of you will know the names of Patrick Collinson, Dermot McCulloch, and Alex Walsham have all delighted in the late Tudor and early Stuart works on English nonconformity at Dr. Williams. And there's Daniel Williams looking rather tubby. Who was Daniel Williams, and where does the idea come from for his library? He was a Presbyterian minister, born near Wrexham in North Wales. I've never worked out whether he could speak Welsh or not. He was just too young to have been involved in the ejections of 1660 to 62, although he was erroneously listed as such by Calamy. In truth, he held no church living at the Restoration from which he might be ejected. He ministered in Dublin from 1667 for 20 years, but then he left fearing for his life because of his open expression of anti-Catholic views, and he moved to London in 1687. In London, Williams befriended the leading nonconformist ministers John Howe and Richard Baxter. In 1689, Williams became minister of Hand Alley Presbyterian Church, Bishopsgate, in the City of London, where he remained until his death. Williams remained close to Richard Baxter until Baxter's death in December 1691, and thereafter Williams continued Baxter's opposition to high Calvinism. Williams benefited from the wealth of his wives. He married twice, both of whom were widows. His first wife died in June 1698. He married again in January 1701, the daughter of a Huguenot merchant. This acquired wealth he used sparingly, so that he might be, quote, useful to others, principally after his death. Williams favoured the 1707 Act of Union with Scotland, and in 1709, perhaps as a result, received honorary doctorates of divinity from Glasgow and Edinburgh universities. He drew up his will in 1711, his ministerial work, leaving his ministerial work principally to his assistant John Evans, who was also from Wrexham but 25 years younger. Williams died in January 1716 and was buried at Bun Hill Fields, just outside the City of London proper, which is 1 square mile, as you may know. His estate was valued at £50,000. He left many legacies, including endowments for the University of Glasgow and Harvard, and for Presbyterian missionary work in Ireland, Scotland, and New England. He also left money to found schools in Wales and for training young men for the ministry. And this is William Bates, another of those older nonconformist Baxter-like ejected ministers. Although our subject is his library, the trust bearing William's name has always been bigger than just the library. His will in print extends to 40 pages, and the library is towards the end of those 40 pages. His direct provision for the library was modest. His original benefaction consisted of about 7,600 books, and Dr. Williams had by then already acquired the libraries of his friend William Bates, this man here, whose painting is purportedly by Kneller, and John Quick, and he acquired those before his death. Bates' collection of works was bought for over £500 and came to form the nucleus of his library, Williams' library. It probably included the Shakespeare First Folio, works of Beaumont and Fletcher, a couple of works of Ben Jonson, and other dramatic works. And Bates had the reputation for being the best linguist in the City of London at the time. The First Folio, I'm afraid, was sold in 2006 in a vain attempt to secure Dr. Williams' library's future. Bates was noted as a gifted preacher and a fine linguist. Did the idea for Dr. Williams' library come from before Bates's death or after his death, and what to do with his books? John Quick's most important bequest to Williams was his manuscript of his work Icones, containing accounts of many French and English divines. Daniel Williams himself approved the first trustees of Dr. Williams Trust, 23 of them, who oversaw and still oversee the library some years before his death. He approved. Antecedents to the library. Another eminent Presbyterian minister of an earlier generation was Lazarus Seaman, a Bartholomean, who died in 1675. He had opened his own collection of books to fellow dissenters, but on his death, his 5,000 volumes were sold in the first public auction of books in England. In 1687, the library of Baxter's friend Thomas Jacob, of over 15,000 books costing near £2,000, was sold at auction. Those sales were necessary in order to leave money for one's family. James Forbes, a Scot, but curiously the independent minister in Gloucester, bequeathed his large library of 1,300 printed books, 300 pamphlets and manuscript material for the benefit of dissenting ministers in Gloucestershire. His library remained in Gloucester until it was sold to Toronto University in 1966. Williams's initiative in wanting his library to survive fits then into the larger concern of nonconformists for the future of learning and how they might serve each other and encourage students for the ministry. The first trustees chosen by Williams include Edmund Calamy, as you can see, the historian of nonconformity, John Evans, Joshua Oldfield, William Tong, Matthew Henry, who managed to die before Williams, dying in 1714, and Benjamin Shepherd, who was Dr. Williams' trustees' foundational receiver, that is, their treasurer and man of business. Many of his trustees were educated at and later tutors at dissenting academies. They were often acquainted with each other, and some were almost related to Williams. Education of the right sort mattered to them. Here we have a map of Cripplegate in the City of London. You can see here at the centre is St Giles Cripplegate. Red Cross Street runs north, and just to the right, if you press yourselves closely to the screen, you can see Williams's library. It's rather a useful map from John Rock, the Huguenot in the early 18th century. The opening of the library, not to the public, although in his will he said he wanted a public library, but it was never quite open to the public in that sense, but only to those invited to use it by the trustees. The opening of the library in 1730 depended largely not on Williams himself through his own generosity, but rather on the efforts of his trustees, who felt that in the execution of their charity, they were under often unsympathetic, if not exactly hostile, scrutiny. They rejected several sites in the city before settling on Red Cross Street. They found the architect, they provided much of the money for the building and for its embellishment from their own pockets, not Williams. Here it is, the first library building pictured in 1829. The library in Gordon Square is the fourth building. This is Red Cross Street. It's right to say that the trustees were not only motivated by a promise made to an old friend now dead, but that they themselves really wanted the library to exist. They saw a need, they wished to meet it. Later, we might also say they provided many books for it from their own collections, usually after their deaths. In truth, Williams's will reflected a high degree of planning which embraced England amid the widespread fears of a Catholic succession, the Church of Scotland, Glasgow University, dissent and education in Wales, charity schools, again principally in Wales, and evangelism in Ireland, funding an itinerant preacher in the Irish language almost until the 1950s, and again also evangelism in the American colonies. In brief, the Trust advanced the vision of an alternative Protestant order, moving beyond the failure to achieve comprehension within the Church of England, which Williams himself had favoured in 1688. The trustees were drawn from London's close-knit Presbyterian community and were mostly conscientious, sharing Williams' vision for their future, an ambitious international vision. And we move to the interior of Red Cross Street, which bears something of a resemblance to the interior of Gordon Square, 14 Gordon Square, where most of you will have known the library. How did the library grow? Dr. Williams left no money for book buying. He left his library, but he didn't leave any money for new books. Was it only from bequests then and from donations? Some gifts of books arrived even before the first library building was erected. By July 1727, and in 1727 the first catalogue of books is published from Dr. Williams. By July 1727, a parcel of books in 4 hogsheads from Monsieur Rondeau, had arrived, and this is probably Jacques Rondeau, a Huguenot minister. By January 1741, an impressive 2,000 books from the late William Harris, a trustee, had been given to the library. Some were duplicates of works already in the library, some were incomplete sets. The trustee's strategy was to keep Harris's duplicates if they were superior to those they already had. Curiously, some books went missing when the library moved from Williams's home in Hoxton, in East London, to Red Cross Street in 1730. Among the missing were Rochester's poems, an unlikely volume ever to have been in the library, you might think, and also the works of Augustine of Hippo, which was rather a curious omission, and they were acquired later. But among those also rejected was Samuel Butler's anti-Puritan polemic, Hudibras. Among the library's most important holdings still, of course, are the Richard Baxter letters and trustees and treatises of great interest to Congregational ministers over the years, the Roger Morris entering book, the Philip Henry papers, including those of his daughter Sarah Savage, and the papers of Owen Stockton, which arrived in the early 18th century, and then, of course, the minutes and papers of the Westminster Assembly of Divines. Almost certainly, the Congregational minister Daniel Neale, who wrote this history of the Puritans, left works for Dr. Williams' library from the collection he'd assembled when preparing his history. The trustee Benjamin Grosvenor in 1755 deposited 4 boxes of manuscripts on English history, probably including the Roger Morris papers. Dr. Williams' library had over 40,000 items from pre-1801 before the important New College London donations arrived after the college closed in 1977. It has, of course, incunabula from pre-1500. Many of you will also realise that the lack of spare money at Dr. Williams has meant that its early modern books have been left uninterfered with. That is, if you want to see what the reader in 1550 or 1650 or 1700 made of the book and what exactly they'd held in their hands, Dr. Williams might be the best place to see it. The big libraries have had so much money, they've rebound their volumes, etc., imposing a common uniform pattern on them. But in so doing, of course, they've removed much of the original structure and character and have lost much of the history of their books. Dr. Williams had often cheap or cheaper versions, allowing the reader an authentic glimpse into the past. In addition, owners' names are retained on the flyleaves and marginal notes may, not always, may be untrimmed. Thomas Hollis, some of you New Englanders will know of his name, the great nephew of his namesake, was a tireless supporter of Dr. Williams's library. A wealthy dissenter, unattached to any congregation, he gave anonymously to many causes, often Republican. He restocked Harvard's library after fire in 1764, and several Dr. Williams trustees felt a sympathy with the American colonists in the 1760s and 1770s. Dr. Williams now contains at least 135,000 printed volumes, half of them published before 1851. Approximately 20,000 of the rare books and pamphlets are in the English short title catalogue. Their subject matter includes not only theology, including Catholic theology, but also church history, philosophy, Hebrew traditions, and other faiths, but also works, surprisingly, on medicine, mathematics, and science, and travel and exploration. And of course, many maps. Dr. Williams has some 90 major manuscript holdings. How did the library become Unitarian is a reasonable question to ask, which it more or less is. Williams only chose Presbyterians as his trustees, the majority of the original 23 being ministers, 14, and 9 being laymen, and all were male. In 1719, at Salters Hall, at 3 years after Williams's death, at Salters Hall in London, the London ministers voted 57 to 53 against the requirement to affirm man-made formulations of doctrine, principally concerned with the Trinity. That is, if it's explicitly biblical, it's acceptable. If it's not, then it isn't. Subscribers affirmed the Trinity, and non-subscribers would not condemn those unhappy with non-scriptural doctrinal formulations. Dr. William's trustees were divided, seriously divided. And over time, new trustees tended to be appointed who were anti-Trinitarian, either Arians or Socinians. Salters Hall was a rupture between Presbyterians and Independents over the Trinity, but it was also about subscription to the doctrine. A younger man and an independent, clearly not there, was Philip Doddridge, and he was never a trustee and he would never subscribe. By the mid to the late 18th century, the trustees had begun to take pride in their radicalism, although the divergence of views between trustees chosen by Williams and their successors was apparent by the 1750s. Those who questioned the Trinity avoided legal penalties by retaining the name Presbyterian, as the Dr. Williams trustees did. Yet to their credit, they distributed largesse without regard to sectarian positions well into the 20th century. In the early 19th century, it was still illegal to be Unitarian in England, so their churches were called Presbyterian, and Dr. Williams trustees were also called Presbyterian. The Dissenters' Chapels Act of 1844 allowed Presbyterian chapels to be known as Unitarian, though there'd been quite a lot of them around well before then. Here we have Anna Letitia Barbauld from the mural, which some of you may know, which lies underneath the pub wallpaper in the lecture hall, Dr. Williams. There she is. Women readers like Barbauld began to appear in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They seem to have come through the action of trustees who'd been expected to sponsor or propose new readers, and borrowing, by the way, was not strictly allowed. In 1757, the library rules provided only for books to be consulted in the reading room, but by the 1790s, borrowing was beginning to be recorded in a separate register. The trustees were borrowing works for non-trustees, for members of their families, for friends, and Barbauld gets in under that basis because her brother and her father were trustees. Her poems were among the library's collection. They were borrowed freely, as was at the time Thomas Bewick's General History of Quadrupeds, that is, books describing animals, drawing of animals, engraving of animals, clearly not theology and not sermons. The first women readers were probably family members then of trustees, sisters, daughters, wives, whose male relatives had borrowed a book for a short time. The trustees then saw themselves as in the forefront of modern society, mingling with William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. And a little later, of course, the other side of Gordon Square, Adelina Stephen lived, and she became a reader in the library. And of course, we're talking about the 1880s, 1890s, and this is later Virginia Woolf. Dr. Williams Library is the big brother of dissenting libraries in England, not Scotland and not Wales. At the outset, it was a rival to the Library of the Church of England, City of London Parsons, Sion College Library, now in Lambeth Palace Library, which was then a copyright library. Dr. Williams Library was situated from 1730, literally only a few yards away from Sion College in Redcross Street, Cripplegate. That was its first home, where it remained until the 1860s, 1864, when the growth of what would then become, not quite then, but would become the London Tube with the Metropolitan Railway, necessitated its sale. Then the library moved to Bloomsbury, where it stayed until now. Therefore, Dr. Williams has already had 4 separate homes, once in Bloomsbury in Queen Square after 1860s, then Grafton Street, and then from 1890 onwards in Gordon Square. In Bloomsbury, it began to attract new readers because it also benefited from the growth of universities. University College London, which backs on to Gordon Square. Obviously would provide certain readers, and so would Bedford College, which was beginning in Bedford Square, a college founded for women, and there are other colleges round about at that time, some of them ministerial training colleges, some of which would later move. But it acquired all sorts of new readers wanted to move there, including some notable Americans who perhaps might not have come to the City of London site. The novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne showed up in July 1859. In 1860, Samuel Drake of Boston, Massachusetts visited. 1861, Joseph Lemuel Chester, an American resident in London, saw John Quick's manuscript. In 1872, the historian Henry Martin Dexter shows up, and he took home several Martin Marprelate tracts, which I don't think he should have been allowed to do. In 1890, of course, Dr. Williams moved to Gordon Square. Once in Bloomsbury, all these new readers are coming, and so many more readers than the library has had in the time I've known it. Throughout that period, however, it is growing in numbers in its holdings. Theophilus Lindsay pastored the first openly Unitarian church in England in Essex Street Chapel, backing onto Temple and near the Law Courts. From 1774. Henry Crabb Robinson left voluminous papers. Henry Crabb Robinson is a man who doesn't know how to have a day without writing down what he's doing, collecting his cleaning bill, and he drops names all the time. Coleridge, William and Dorothy Wordsworth, Charles Lamb, William Blake, Sarah Burney, as well as Goethe, Schiller, and other leading German intellectuals. The papers of Lindsay and Robinson are in Dr. Williams. As is the correspondence of the scientist and theologian Joseph Priestley, and some material relating to Isaac Watts is acquired in the 19th century. Later come papers of James Martineau, and Dr. Williams also has an interesting collection of hymn books. Has a fine collection of portraits, also 300 portraits, notably included principally for the subjects and not always recording the artists. So they may include John Riley, John Opie, William Arto, Godfrey Kneller, Henry Fuseli, and Joseph Highmore. This is Roger Thomas, who makes a change. In the 1940s, when he becomes a librarian, he introduces women trustees. And he then begins also to introduce non-Unitarian trustees. And it's then that people like Geoffrey Nuttall, who some of you may know and whose work you may have known, Geoffrey is among the first non-Unitarian trustees. He joined in 1947. He stayed on the trust for almost 50 years, is responsible for the deposit of New College London material, which includes records of the dissenting academies and material relating to Philip and Mercy Doddridge. And Geoffrey Nuttall, whose life in many ways embodied the Puritan spirit, died in 2007, age 95. And after his death, other trustees told me there was a discernible loss of knowledge and gravity at their meetings. Would he have agreed to sell the first folio of Shakespeare? Probably not, but he would have found an alternative method of raising the money. Where does Dr. Williams' library go from here? Can it really survive? Well, I'm told that there are 3 possible universities who might take it on, but the decision will be made later this year, and I think I better be quiet.
Dr. Williams's library had been on the go for just over 100 years when the Congregational Library got going. I think a spur may have been the repeal of the Test Acts in 1829, which were a series of acts put in place at the Restoration, on which nonconformists had laboured for well over a century. Because it was the following year, 1830, that the Congregational Library first started to be thought about. It was the brainchild of Joshua Wilson, of whom we shall hear more during this talk. It was opened on the 9th of May, 1831, and the following day, the 10th of May, the Congregational Union was founded. And this shows, I think, that the library was not a standalone project, but it was part of a much larger idea. The founding of a Congregational Union was always going to be controversial, because the other name for congregational is independent. Each congregation expects to be independent, so that any overarching authority it can be thought of as questionable. Some county unions had been put in place by this time, but this was the beginning of the national union, the Congregational Union of England and Wales. The library was, I suppose, felt to be needed, not only as a place where people could come and read books, but also as a meeting place, an orthodox nonconformist meeting place. Nonconformists had been content during the Georgian period to meet in rooms above taverns. This was starting to be thought not quite proper. And of course, the other problem was Dr. Williams's library itself, which, as Alan has explained to us, had become a Unitarian institution by this time, and was therefore objectionable to a large number of Congregationalists. Once the library was opened, a series of lectures was started, and these were quite successful. They were held almost every year for 20 years. Most of the books were given by Joshua Wilson himself, although there were other early donors. John Bickerton Williams, the expert on Philip and Matthew Henry and their descendants, gave books, and Robert Mackenzie Beverley gave one of the most interesting donations, though not one of the more relevant ones. His donation was early printed books and medieval manuscripts, including things which are marked as having come from French monasteries, being sold off after the Revolution. So that gave the library a fairly broad scope at the beginning. It never really took off as a library, and by the 1850s, the stability of the building, which was in Blomfield Street, not too far from Red Cross Street, the stability of the building was doubted. And in 1856, a dangerous structures notice was served on it. Consequently, for one reason and another, it probably came as a relief when the building was acquired for railway extensions in 1865. These were the same extensions that caused Dr. Williams's library to move from Red Cross Street to Bloomsbury, though the Congregational Library didn't follow to Bloomsbury for nearly 100 years. Nevertheless, it was the same bit of railway line that caused both libraries to start wandering. In 1862, the bicentenary of the ejections in 1662, when at the Restoration, many of the, well, nearly 2,000 of the Puritan ministers felt obliged to leave their livings. This was commemorated in 1862 very enthusiastically, and it was decided to build a memorial hall in commemoration, which would also include the Congregational Library. A site was found in Farringdon Street, still in the City of London, and a site which had once been occupied by the Fleet Prison, where the separatists, Barrow and Greenwood, had been imprisoned. So this seemed very appropriate. The foundation stone was eventually laid in 1872, and the library finally opened, or the Congregational Memorial Hall and Library, in January 1875. Joshua Wilson had died a few months earlier, but his widow gave his entire private library to the new library, and this became the core of all its holdings, and indeed it still holds that status. Because he was an early Victorian, Wilson very much looked back to the Puritan period as the heroic age of nonconformity. And there was an emphasis on the 17th century in the enormous numbers of books that he put together in his collection. Like a lot of wealthy men, he had a mean streak, and I think he liked to buy his books quite cheaply. When he had bought them, he didn't do what many Victorian collectors did, which was to have their books expensively rebound in full leather and lots of gold leaf. Rather, he kept the books exactly as they had been printed and bound up at the beginning. And so, as with some parts of Dr. Williams's library, the Congregational Library gives people a very good opportunity to see books, not in a fine condition, but in the same condition in which they were read several hundred years ago. We've never had a portrait of Joshua Wilson to hang on the wall. He was quite shy in that respect, and we've always had a portrait of his father, Thomas Wilson, who was a great chapel builder and puller of strings behind the scenes of Congregationalism. So we've had the portrait of Thomas Wilson really in place of Joshua. And indeed, until comparatively recent, it was thought that there was no portrait of him surviving. Eventually, a very small portrait was found in the Jubilee volume of a society connected with nonconformist missions to the Jews. And so we can't say now that we haven't got a portrait of him, though we still haven't got one suitable for exhibiting in a place of honour. A printed catalogue of the library had been mooted as far back as 1833, but none was actually produced until 1886. And for reasons which I've never understood, even then it was printed, but not circulated. And copies of this first catalogue are now extremely rare. I believe the Congregational Library only has one copy of its own. A few other libraries do have copies, but as I say, it's difficult to get hold of. Eventually, a new catalogue was published in 1895, with a second volume in 1910. And these two volumes are still quite useful in some ways, and we do still have a small stock of them. So this can still be bought. The best thing that happened to the library in the years after Joshua Wilson was the appointment of the Reverend Thomas George Crippen as librarian, which happened in 1896. He, like Wilson, had a very comprehensive approach to what he did. And he was instrumental in the founding of the Congregational Historical Society in 1899. He became its secretary and the editor of its transactions. And his idea was very much that the treasures of the library should be studied and the results published in the transactions. And for a while, the library flourished under his direction. But by the time of the First World War, money for new purchases had practically dried up, and there was nobody left on the committee of the Memorial Hall who was really sympathetic to the library. Consequently, by the time Crippen resigned in 1925, by which time he was 84, he was quite disappointed and even embittered. during all this time that the library was by no means the only thing at the Memorial Hall. There were offices which were let to various bodies, often bodies that were sympathetic to Congregationalism and to the things that it did. And there was a large hall above the library, which was very popular for meetings, especially ones of a left-wing tendency. And indeed, it was very popular with the growing trade union movement. Consequently, our books were only yards away when the Labour Party was formed in 1900, and the decision to proceed with the general strike was taken in 1926. The 1930s was a particularly low period for the library. It was even thought of several times that it might close altogether. And in 1939, when the war came, like so many other things, it did close down. Some of the books and pictures were taken away to safety, but most of them remained on the premises, which were actually in 1941 converted into a British restaurant, which was a scheme to provide workers in the city with good, cheap meals. This lasted, in fact, quite a while after the war. It didn't stop till 1950. So for all that time, the books had to compete with the steam of soup and puddings, which they don't seem to have suffered from very much. But it's certainly something which they got quite a lot of for nearly 10 years. The library was redecorated for the Festival of Britain in 1951, but not finally reopened until 1957. A new series of lectures was started in 1958, and the 1960s might have been a new golden age for the library, although in fact external events prevented this from happening. In the 1960s, the Congregational Union turned itself into the Congregational Church with a view to combining with the Presbyterian Church in England to form the United Reformed Church. This was not really a very successful attempt at humanism, in that several groups of Congregationalists held aloof from it, as a result of which the Congregational Federation was formed, the Evangelical Fellowship of Congregational Churches, and there was even a small group of unattached Congregational churches. So that in fact the result was far more bodies than had been started with. At the same time, and he took away one of the main purposes of the library, which was to support the Congregational Union. At the same time, the trustees of the Memorial Hall decided the building was getting to the end of its usefulness, and they were going to build a smart new office block on the site. This also appeared in 1972. It was called Caroon House. The library was at first given its own wing in this new office block, and to judge from the photographs, the books were as well and attractively housed as they've ever been. Unfortunately, the public stayed away, and the library got practically no visitors. As a result of this, or as an attempt to do something about the situation, the Memorial Hall trustees appealed to the trustees of Dr. Williams's library and started to enter into negotiations to take the library to Gordon Square. It moved there in 1982 and was administered by Dr. Williams's, though still owned by the Memorial Hall Trust. A new series of congregational lectures was started in 1987. But on the whole, the library was rather static in the 1980s and 90s. We didn't buy very much, and people didn't give us very much. In fact, they continued to give congregational material to Dr. Williams's until I think we'd established ourselves, established more of a profile as far as the public was concerned. Things got a bit more dynamic from 2000 and onwards. The Friends of the Congregational Library was founded in 2001. We started in taking in great quantities of archives. The old Congregational Union archive in 1999, and then following that, the archives of the various bodies that had replaced it. The United Reformed Church in 2015, the unattached congregational churches at about the same time, and then the EFCC, the Evangelical wing, in 2017. So in fact, only the Congregational Federation have not yet handed over their archives. In 2005, an archive of ministers' papers was begun, and this was again very successful in attracting donations. We also started to get large donations of printed books from all sorts of people, especially the descendants of ministers. This was all very successful, but we were becoming increasingly desperate for space. And we were still thinking how to get around this problem when the surveyors came into the building and warned us that it was likely to collapse if all the books weren't moved out. And so we started packing everything up. Originally, the idea was that the floors would all be strengthened and the books would come back. But it eventually became clear that this was not going to be possible. And under the stress of this crisis, Dr. Williams's library and the Congregational Library parted company. This happened in May 2022. So we'd been together for exactly 40 years. Since then, the Congregational Library has operated a temporary reading room at Brixton. All our books are still in storage, but we get them out as far as we can for readers who ask for them, and this has been really very successful. Negotiations then started with Westminster College, Cambridge, where we are going to move. We haven't moved any of the books yet, but the books, or as many books as they've got room for, will be moved there during the rest of 2024. Some things will have to stay in storage, but it does seem to be at Westminster College that the future of the Congregational Library now lies.
That was great. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite Alan up to join us as well. I took pages of notes off all of what you were sharing with us. These are rich, long histories, and you both did a great job of, talking, not making it sort of always a triumphal story, right? These are stories of ebbs and flows, but one ultimately of sort of continuity. I'm sort of curious about the life of the library in the life of the church, or the extent we can sort of say that. Is it, when you look back on these histories, do you see more evidence of sort of the role a library can play within Unitarianism, within Congregationalism, or is it more a story of the role that the Unitarianism or Congregationalism play within the library itself? What role do you kind of see libraries playing over this long durée?
I'll go first, shall I? I don't know, Kyle, really, because I mean, probably like you, I'm somebody who absolutely loves libraries. So I can't live without them. I can't imagine anybody would want to. And yet, of course, students now, lay preachers now prefer to download stuff on the internet, and therefore probably don't go to libraries very little. So I realize I'm a dinosaur, and I mean, technology, I'll use it, of course, but I'm much happier with going to a library. And of course, as you know, you go in, you want to see one particular book, you find it on the shelf, and you start looking at 3 or 4 others alongside it, and suddenly you've entered a different world. And I don't know how that happens, whether it does happen online or not. But of course, being online is wonderful if you live in the Outer Hebrides, and there are no libraries for you to get access to. But in London, I've got no excuse.
David?
Well, I think for my part, I would say that there isn't one answer to your question. That it's changed radically over the years. I think both libraries were intended to be a support to ministers
Yes.
in the first place, and there was still the remains of that because I came to Dr. Williams's just after the Congregational Library arrived in 1982. And at that time, the library was still sending out parcels of books to country ministers. I mean, in the old-fashioned way. But it gradually declined. And I think probably, by approximately the turn of the century, that way of carrying on was done with. And of course, the other thing is that again, both libraries now tend to serve not so much ministers as scholars studying the history of the denominations. And that's it's to the extent that it's often our manuscript collections most people come and look at, but rather than the printed books or the manuscript collections and the older printed books, not the modern ones, which might be of practical use to people. So that's. But I don't think we have much. As libraries, we don't have much control over those situations. We can only try and react to them as best we can.
And there's a great question here about digitization of your collections. Is that, has it been a focus? Is it part of the conversation to be digitizing materials, or are there impediments to doing that work?
Yeah, it's not really a question I can answer entirely, Kyle. I think it needs money, and again, Dr. Williams doesn't have it. And I mean, I'm old hat, as you said, former research fellow. So I don't quite know what their plans are. And I assume once the library is taken up by another university, then perhaps plans along those lines to further digitize might develop. Yeah, Baxter and his treatises have been digitized, of course, the Baxter treatises, but not everything.
Is digitization something that the Congregational Library is able to undertake right now, or?
Well, I suppose until recently we were basically operating the same policies all the time as Dr. Williams did. So what's true of one library is true of the other, and we haven't made very much progress in that. I mean, certain things have been talked about. For instance, that the Christian World, which is a newspaper that we have the full run of, has been talked about. But I think in fact the British Library are ahead of us in that, and that there may be less need for that now than there was when we started talking about it. I mean, the fact is, we've struggled even to get our catalogues fully digitized, let alone all the books. I am hoping that our Congregational Library catalogue of printed books will be fairly complete by the time we hand over to Westminster. But that has been, as I say, quite a struggle because we simply haven't had the numbers of people that the job has required.
One of the things that's fascinating to me, and when we look at the original catalog for the American Congregational Library, is that it is out of the 56 books, there's only 4 manuscripts. And if you look at them, they're 2 of the 4 are bound. Where, when do libraries become archives? Do you think Dr. Williams thought that he was creating what was going to be the repository for all of these family papers and institutional papers? Did Joshua Wilson think that way? Or was that part of maybe the natural organic development of what Congregationalists and Unitarians needed out of the institution?
I don't think that Daniel Williams had any thoughts along those lines at all. And I suspect the first trustees didn't. But of course, once those trustees die, or they are near death 20, 30 years later, clearly they're remembering an earlier period when Queen Anne's on the throne, there's a possible Stuart Catholic succession, they're worried about things. All those concerns suddenly become important, and 30, 40 years earlier, what they were thinking then, it's an archive. Yeah, so I think it's a natural development.
And I would say that Joshua Wilson probably was thinking more along those lines, simply because he was 100 years later, and he was a collector of manuscripts as well as printed books. So that would be a natural way for him to think.
So thank you so much for sharing these great stories with us. I want to ask you one sort of final question before we have to wrap up. And this is, you didn't know this one was coming, but say the Congregational Library and DWL hadn't been founded, and that Joshua Wilson and Daniel Williams were to walk in today and say, we want to found a library. How similar do you think the library they would create today would look like the one that exists now, the ones that exist now, or do you think they would do something different?
That's a very difficult question to answer, Kyle. And it's intriguing. Almost certainly they do something different. I don't know what it's like in the States, but here, most ministers in training, and possibly a lot of my colleagues then as ministers, really aren't interested in history. And it's David said the Congregational Federation, of which I'm a minister, the Congregational Federation has not deposited its records with the Congregational Library. And that's because in my view, successive general secretaries of the Congregational Federation have really been dismissive of history. So they don't bother to keep their records. It's only for now. They're not interested in 10, 20 years. They don't think about what people might think of what they're doing now. May be interesting. I think that's very shallow. And I think, unfortunately, an awful lot of modern Christians are shallow in that way. But, who am I to say? So what would they do now if they wanted to found a library? Would they even found a library?
Are you more optimistic, David?
Well, again, I mean, there might be a different answer for the two. I mean, Dr. Williams was a very practical man, and if he was still around, might be very modern in his ideas. But Joshua Wilson was much more bookish, much more interested in history, and so I dare say he might have been more likely to found something on the same lines.
That's great, and I know that it's we don't have a time capsule. We can't go back and bring them forward. But thank you both so much. I think this is great, and your presentations have really helped me kind of think about the American Congregational Library coming in as the third leg of the stool, I guess. I think a great question that I really want to ponder is, are there other congregational libraries out there?
Yes.
And are there similar impulses that are happening in their formation? And I think one thing that you've both nicely brought forth is that when you are founded also maybe shapes your development, right? If you're founded in the early 18th century, you're in a different period and different way of thinking than in the 19th century. And as we've just talked about now, in the 21st century, you could have a completely different mindset. I'm going to stay optimistic that libraries of all sorts will continue to be with us, and that we will, through programs like this, really encourage people to connect with their history, understand that the past is often prologue for the present and future.
Thank
Thanks
you, Kyle. Thank you
Right,
all.
thank you.